Okay. Good afternoon, good morning. My name is Natasha Peterson. I am a communications coordinator with the National American Indian and Alaska Native MHTTC. It is wonderful to have you all today. I am very happy to have Dr. Ken Winters with us today. He will be presenting cannabis use and risk for mental illness. This event is brought to you by the National American Indian and Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. We are located at the University of Iowa, and we are part of a national MHTTC network, which you can see here on our map. This project is supported by SAMHSA. The content is developed by the presenter, and the opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the American Indian and Alaska Native MHTTC. Following today's event, we will send out a follow-up email, which will include links to the presentation slides and recording, information about how to request and receive CEUs for this presentation, and the link to our evaluation survey, or GIPRA. At the end of today's event, we will also share the link to our evaluation survey in the chat box, and the survey is very important to us, so if you could fill that out, take some time, we would really appreciate it. Although we are gathered virtually today, we want to take the time to acknowledge the land and pay respect to the Indigenous nations whose homelands were forcibly taken and inhabited. Please take a moment to read this land acknowledgement, which was created by 3 members of our team, Ella and Keely Driscoll and Sean Bear. This will also be included in the slides that you will have access to. Today's speaker is Ken Winters. He has been a consultant with us for several years now, and he is a senior scientist at the Oregon Research Institute. Previously, he was a professor, Department of Psychiatry at the University of Minnesota, where he founded and directed the Center for Adolescent Substance Abuse Research for 25 years. His primary research interests are adolescent health with a focus on substance abuse and coexisting mental and behavioral disorders. So with that, we will stop screen sharing and let you share your screen, Ken, and we will hand it over to you.
Thank you much, Natasha. Hello, everybody. I appreciate this opportunity. I hope you can find this talk today useful. You will get these slides, and the first slide has my email, so that means you can email me if you have a follow-up question if we don't have time at the conclusion when there might be some Q&A. I'm going to tackle 5 topics and then summarize, so it's quite a bit to pack in 1 hour, but I thought it would be useful to give background about cannabis, which really is going to be a focus on THC, and then delve into the issues surrounding the intersection of cannabis use and mental health, and then what you can do about it, whether you're doing prevention work or treatment work.
Ken, I don't want to interrupt you. I think we're having, oh, perfect. Never mind. It was cut off and now it's looking good.
We're good. Okay. Everyone see this? It says summary points.
Perfect.
I thought I'd tell you the basic concluding topics first, and then you'll see how I'll try to unfold them throughout the next hour. So there's really these major points I'm going to try to make for you. And you'll see where science is supporting them in a large degree or not so large degree. But there is, I think, growing evidence, it's getting quite rigorous these days, that THC, the main psychoactive component of the cannabis plant, appears to be a significant contributor to mental illness, particularly with respect to psychotic disorders or psychosis. And this risk is elevated if at least 3 things are occurring. You use it during adolescence, you're a regular user, and you use that over an extended period of time, and you're using high potency THC. So if you're doing all 3 of those, that really elevates the risk. If you're not doing all 3, that would be a bit of a lower risk. But the good news is that there can be symptom improvement with one's psychosis in terms of symptom severity and the course of the disorder if somebody stops using or doesn't use at all. We'll talk about the other component in the plant that gets a lot of attention, CBD, cannabidiol, and whether it's medicine or not, we'll look at that. Interesting question. And then 2 main points for you as behavioral health professionals. If you have the opportunity to educate the public, I think it's important that they realize that the cannabis mental illness link is very important public health issue. People need to be aware of that if they're taking a strong pro-marijuana or pro-cannabis stance. And then there are several things you can do as a service provider. If you have people that are using THC that you're treating, and the bottom line is try to get those clients THC free. So more on all of those coming up. Before we get into the heart of the talk, just some introductory comments. One has to do with diagnostic terminology. I can appreciate that many American Indian, Alaska Native clients find it problematic when labels and diagnostic systems are used. Many times we have to use them for paperwork purposes, but the process of naming and labeling can have spiritual significance, and it can influence how well you connect with a client and how well they want to follow treatment. So it's, as a clinician, you want to be careful of that. And even diagnosing somebody for mental illness, whether it's psychosis or other disorders, sometimes symptoms that we might think are true to a diagnosis are really not, because they may emanate from a very different meaning and context by natives and in native country. So one has to be careful not to go down the road of falsely calling something a positive symptom or a present symptom. I'll try to minimize my use of these diagnostic terms, but some of the studies use them, some of the labels and slides have them, because that so often is what goes on in scientific literature. My focus on cannabis and the link to mental illness does not minimize the role of so many other important risk factors that are part of the pathway towards mental health, or if things go wrong, towards mental illness. And when it comes to American Indian, Alaska Natives, the large group of risk factors that are talked about, known in the literature, they really are quite similar in Native individuals compared also to non-Native. So often when you do read the literature and thinking about risk factors that are both predictors of health or mental illness, even if somebody didn't study Native populations or have a sample with that group, you still can, I think, be quite informed from that literature. If you're interested in more detail about mental illness among American Indians and Alaska Natives, with the support of MHTTC, there are 2 videos you could view. These were videos of presentations made by Dale Walker and myself a couple years ago. There's 2 of them because one of them is more general about psychosis and the second one is more specific about early onset psychosis. But a lot of detail in those presentations about risk factors, onset, and treatment. Not a cannabis talk, but more of an important, broad, comprehensive talk about psychosis. A little bit about cannabis. It is still a Schedule I drug, although that's getting debated. You may read and hear about that at the federal level. Some states are making a case that they're not going to call it a Schedule I drug, which is an interesting political situation going on, where states want to do something different than what the FDA is at this point going with. There really are 3 types of cannabis plants, but most of us know about sativa because that's the one that usually produces the high quality product. The plant has a lot of compounds. So when you're using cannabis, you're ingesting more than 500 compounds. 100 of them are called cannabinoids, and those are the components of the plant that have a lot to do with getting high or impacting other parts of your body. Under that, you can see I have 3 sub-bullets. because those are the three that get the most attention these days. THC or Delta-9, we'll talk mostly about that because that's the so-called intoxicant, and it might have medicinal properties. Delta-8 gets some attention these days. It might be an intoxicant. It might be legal, it might not be, kind of a mystery component of the plant. And then CBD or cannabidiol, that gets a lot of attention. Probably more evidence that it's medicinal, but it doesn't get you high in the same sense that THC does. So it's why it's often sold in all over the place, because it's not considered a psychoactive drug in the same way the intoxicants are. And so even in states that don't legalize cannabis, cannabidiol can be sold. And you might know of a lot of ads and opportunities to buy it on the internet. Whether it's snake oil or really good is being debated. Okay, a little detail about these three components. THC in the cannabis plant, the intoxicant, the potency you get from a particular product can vary. You can see I've sort of put the top three from minimal amount to hashish to hash oil, and you can go up quite a bit to very intense THC products. Tinctures is not legal in the US, but it is in Canada. And this is where cannabis products are infused with alcohol. The potency of that is not always known. You'll likely see an effort of the beverage industry wanting to combine THC with it in the future. Or at least there's going to be a push for it. I gotta presume. The THC potency of typical samples in America are increasing. You can see when this has been studied, efforts to try to figure out what's the typical amount of potency of what's sold on the streets or available on the streets. It's gone, roughly around the 4% range in 1995. In fact, that was about the typical potency back in the 70s. So if we have some folks here that might have dabbled in it when you were a teenager in the 60s and 70s, you probably were sampling something in the range of 3 to 4% intensity. And now the intensity is, of course, much, much higher. And that's got a lot of implications, doesn't it? The one analogy I make, imagine when you were a high school student and the world had just discovered alcohol, and the only kind of alcohol available was beer. So all of your experience with alcohol was just beer, roughly 3-4% amount of alcohol in it. But then imagine as generations moved on, other kinds of liquor were discovered and invented, and then all of a sudden hard liquor became available. And that's 40-50% amount of alcohol in it. And that's pretty much what the young generation now has available. They're ignoring, of course, the beer level. They have available the very, very hard stuff. It does have implications for how we understand everything I'm going to tell you downstream, because so much of the science could be somewhat outdated. This is a quote from a publication by the director of NIDA, Nora Volkoff, that reminds us the changing landscape of cannabis, examples, strains, the THC potency, new routes of administration, novel drug combinations, and a culture of rapidly changing norms and perceptions raise the possibility that our current limited knowledge may only apply to the ways the drug was used in the past. I'll remind us of this as we continue to talk about some of the studies, which means we might have to correct for how we view results from older studies compared to newer studies. I mentioned CBD. It's different from THC in several ways. It has minimal direct activity to the main cannabinoid receptors in the brain. We'll get into that in a minute. Its impact on those receptors does not, at this point, known to science and to human experience, lead to what I call an intoxicating effect. It's unclear if CBD helps you minimize the effects of THC. So there is some, I think it's probably myth that if you're high on THC and you have to get behind the wheel of a car and you're a little worried about your driving ability, well, why don't I just take a CBD pill because that'll help dampen my THC effect. It's not clear that is the case. It's unclear to what extent it is effective medicine. There we'll talk more about that if we have time. There surely is a lot of anecdotal and case illustrations that it's effective, but I'm not sure what we're talking about. Is it a great placebo effect drug? Is it a drug that hasn't just been studied and people are informally discovering it? Or is it a combination? Not sure. Delta 8 is getting a little attention because it's not THC. So is it a Schedule 1 drug or not? It's not clear. It's often sold and promoted as being legal since it is extracted from the hemp plant, which is usually 99% CBD. So, you know, you can legally grow hemp in America nowadays and not be committing a crime as long as you got the hemp plant and growing it correctly. But because often the Delta 8 product is synthesized, then it might mean that it could cross over into being an illegal substance. So not sure yet. It's not a lot of consistency on how to view it. There's 3 routes of administering it: inhalation, oral ingestion, and topical. And if you want to get high the quickest, it's inhalation is the most efficient. Oral ingestion is less efficient, and then topical is very inefficient. Obviously, people probably know you can smoke it and vape THC. Its effects vary in people, but it can last up to 4 hours, depending on your tolerance and the potency, but you can get an immediate effect. Vaping is not entirely safe. You're really aerosoling, not vaping water vapor. Dabbing, which is a way you can vape high potency product, can have up to 80% THC. It's like basically vaping hash when you're doing a dabbing type ingestion. Orally, the mystery here for people is be careful because you get later onset or delayed onset, they call it. You can eat a full brownie that might have way too much THC for you. You don't feel anything, and then in 1 hour, boom, you're impacted quite a bit. And the effects can linger for quite a while. We'll see about mixing it with beverages downstream. Not yet in America, but maybe coming to your local market soon. And then there's the topical version of THC. Now there's also topical CDC. That's often sold as an effective muscle relaxant. But if you're going to use it, the THC topically, it can have a quick onset and effects can linger up to 48 hours. You got to make sure to get the transdermal version though. Some products do not penetrate the skin, and that would probably not be a good product. Might be sold as a transdermal or promoted as going to be effective as a rub-on product, but you got to be careful when you're buying. Okay, enough of the introductory comments. Let's talk about some general principles about THC affecting the brain. So we're just going to focus on THC right now. There's a lot of what are called cannabinoid or THC receptors in the brain. On the left are the specific names of the regions, and on the right, a little simpler way to understand it, you can see all the various, I call them human behaviors or parts of human behavior that are impacted by THC, because we have a lot of cannabinoid receptors. So it makes sense if you have ever used or you talk to somebody who's used, it can affect, how you see, motor coordination, how you think, how you remember, how you drive, appetite, sleep, etc., motivation, a lot of things. So we have cannabinoid receptors all over the brain, which is kind of interesting. So if you believe in evolutionary biology, it would make sense that these are important to us, important for development or human behavior and survival, since they're so present throughout the brain. In fact, they're also present in other parts of the body. We have cannabinoid receptors in the gut as well as in our reproductive region. So not only is brain functioning going to be impacted, but appetite based on your stomach signaling and food intake behavior, and it can impact reproduction. The last item is important because we don't know long-term effects yet, because not enough people have been studied, have been using it. But if it has a depressive effect on cardiovascular functioning, that could have long-term implications. So with the help of two other scientists, Dr. Kim and Dr. Forti, they have educated me on a way to look at why cannabinoid receptors and the cannabinoid system is important to humans. And it has a purpose and a value. They have distinguished. They're somewhat similar, but one way to look at the purpose of the cannabinoid system is that it provides the main volume control for several neurotransmitters, not just those that are related to cannabinoids, that affect all kinds of things related to our human functioning and the human body, including pleasure, mood, pain, appetite, motivation, and memory. So I have the volume dial to the right as one of the metaphors. But the other value of it is that it not only is a volume dial, but it also acts like a safety net or a safety helmet, because it helps make sure the dial doesn't go out of whack. That is normal functioning cannabinoid system, if you're not overactivating it or disrupting it with use of THC. But so it's both the dial and the controls on the dial, or I think it was, Dr. Forti used the safety helmet that just helps regulate and give safety to your, I'll call it your brain volume dial. And it's not just one function either. As you can see in that first bullet, we're talking about mood and cognition and motivation, etc. Some people suffer from cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. You might have heard of this. This is where rare but can happen in people who are chronic long-term users, and they get these bouts of vomiting and an abdominal pain. The symptoms can be severe. They can last up to 2 days. Good news is if you stop using, the symptoms will abate, but you have to be basically abstinent because the symptoms will resume if you start up your use again. Okay, more specific now. The next four topic areas, I'm going to really delve into the intersection now of cannabis and mental illness. So let's just look at, well, what is the literature when we want to ask the question, what's the extent of use of cannabis and either getting psychosis or other illnesses or worsening your symptoms and your disorder? There's several reviews. So I'm just going to go down the road of some of the I thought prominent reviews in the literature, which is kind of interesting because there's already enough data that people could publish rigorous literature reviews. 20 years ago, we didn't have that luxury. Even 10 years ago, didn't. Now, this first one from 2017 comes from the Institute of Medicine, which convened at the level of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, a group that studied the whole topic of health effects of cannabis. And it's an interesting report. If you download the user-friendly version, I think you'll find it informative. I'm just highlighting one very small section of it, but they categorized where there's strong evidence or not so strong. And this is the category where they said there's either substantial or moderate evidence about cannabis being associated with the following adverse effects. And I have 6 of them up here. They're a mix of either substantial or moderate. My apologies, I didn't separate them out. I lumped here, but I just highlighted with larger font that they considered it very reasonable, strong evidence that a cannabis use contributes to the development of schizophrenia or other psychoses, and then the data suggests the highest risk among the heavy users. In a literature review that was published in 2018, Dr. Miller reviewed what was available to her at the time, which means right up to about 2017. And she categorized the studies by disorder and whether there was cross-sectional data or longitudinal data, and then wrote a lot about to what extent is there a lot of studies supporting a link between cannabis use and the disorders, or very few or no studies. So this is my ability to summarize what she wrote. And so I have basically, she summarized 5 disorders, although risk of suicide would be part of depression. And then had summarized and discussed what's the strength of data for cross-sectional and longitudinal. And then I put the plus symbols, whether she said there were several studies, that would be 2 pluses. If there's a box with 1, that's just a few studies. And then if there's, like here, no pluses, that means there were no studies. And now, only talking about studies that she said, well, there was a strong association or strong affirmation that cannabis use was linked to the disorder at hand. Anyway, so what do you know from this? Schizophrenia obviously has the strongest data, both from a cross-sectional and longitudinal level, linking cannabis use to either the onset or the course of that disorder. A lot of cross-sectional data for the other disorders. You can make a case that there's a few studies longitudinally for anxiety and depression. So she looked at several and found reasonable link, particularly strong link for one and a reasonable link for other disorders. So what about just if we focus on depression and anxiety? Because it turns out there were some recent studies that just looked at that cluster. So non-psychotic disorders. Now we're talking about depression and anxiety. And this one was a publication in 2021. It's a meta-analysis. You may know that that's basically a sophisticated way of doing a literature summary with using mathematical techniques. And here's the soundbite conclusion: the rates of comorbid major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder were 3.2 times higher in people who have a cannabis use disorder. So strong association. It didn't say which preceded which, because you can make a case that people drifted towards cannabis because they were already suffering from depression and anxiety. And so that's why you got the association, which would be a good caveat to remind us that this isn't very causal, but it is an important link. And it surely tells us that if you have clients with depression and anxiety, you want to, for sure, assess for substance use, but I would make a case you really want to hone in if they're using cannabis and encourage them to stop using. So another literature review, this was a meta-analysis plus a little bit extra. They had some studies that didn't fit the meta-analysis, so they included though as part of a sub-review within the same article, 2021. And what's this looking at? This is looking at young adulthood age group and looking at depression, anxiety, and suicidality. So there were so many studies that they were able to really make some conclusions based on almost 23,500 individuals across 11 longitudinal studies. So that's kind of strong, isn't it? All of them were longitudinal, so they can look at how things change across time with people's symptoms as a function of their change of cannabis use. And they had roughly 1/3 of the sample were non-cannabis users, and then 2/3 were cannabis users. So they found no greater risk among cannabis users compared to non-cannabis users for anxiety disorders. That was kind of interesting. Remember, that doesn't square with the prior study, but big association with cannabis users and depression, suicide, terms of ideation, and suicidal attempt. You can see the more times likely. Now that's always comparing it to the non-users, non-cannabis users. So one way of saying it is non-cannabis users, sorry, I should go this way. Cannabis users were 1 to 3 times more likely to suffer from a depressive disorder at some point in their young adulthood compared to those in young adulthood that did not use cannabis. And you can see the worst stat is the bottom one, 3.5 times more likely to have a suicidal attempt. As many of you may know, you can be suicidal, have suicidal thinking. You don't necessarily have a severe problem with depression or even a diagnosable depressive disorder. And in young adulthood is a risky period to begin with. So it looks like a particularly bad mix. Young adulthood, heavy use of cannabis, and as a risk towards suicidality. One other study that just came out, this had 280,000 young adults. This was based on American data, and they used a large medical database. And they were looking at the risk of suicide ideation, suicide planning, and suicide attempts among young adults. So this really honed in on the suicide topic. I'll read the quote at the bottom. While we cannot establish that cannabis use caused the increased suicidality that we observed in this study, these associations warrant further research. So they found a strong link, and it was a bit stronger for women than men. All right, next up are psychotic disorders. These are the three that often get lumped together when researchers talk about psychosis or psychotic disorder. Some of the studies coming up just focus on schizophrenia. So I'm just showing you the major studies that have had the luxury of large samples. And one of them coming up was longitudinal. This is a bit confusing. It's not longitudinal data, but it is looking at, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, no, 11 databases, all from Europe, that had the opportunity to look at what was the risk of psychosis based on what they called cannabis exposure or level of cannabis use. So this is basically kind of sorting out, were you just a infrequent user, weekly, daily heavy user would probably be the people way at the far end here. And then they looked at, all right, what's the prevalence of psychosis, some psychotic disorder, based or as a function of this level of cannabis exposure. You can see the relationship for all these different studies is pretty similar. Some of them don't have very strong relationship, and then there's 3 or 4 that have a really strong relationship. This just as a summary stat, one way of saying this, well, the odds are roughly, that you would increase your risk of having psychosis by about 4 times if you use cannabis, as opposed to people who didn't use cannabis. And then if you used heavily, then that would be folks that are right around here, which means they were at the high end of cannabis exposure. And then if you cast your eyes over to the left, you can see the odds ratios are more in the 7 to 5. So if you're a heavy cannabis user, your odds then increase to 6 or 7-ish. But a great multi-site study from Forti and colleagues that is even better than all the things I've shown you so far, because it was multiple sites and they had an opportunity to look at not just the link of cannabis use and psychosis, but they had the opportunity to look at what was the level of intensity, what was the THC potency of those people that were using cannabis and the psychosis link. Because so far, people have not been able to sort that out. There's just been, the belief that high level potency is probably going to be linked to higher risk. Well, the Forti group and their team were able to nail this down with great detail. So several European sites plus Brazil. Brazil didn't get on this map, but the next 2 slides is the data. So these are our line graphs. And there's two lines, and there's 10 data points representing all the various sites. So here's all the European, and then the far right one is Brazil, right over here. Anyway, what's the yellow and what's the green mean? The green is the prevalence of daily cannabis use in the population that they studied. And yellow is the adjusted psychosis incidence rate. So this is an important concept, incidence or first episode. They're not just measuring historical rate of psychosis, because then when you do that, you have a tough time figuring out, well, which came first? This is looking at new cases that are popping up in these various cities or regions of psychosis and looking at what was the prevalence of daily cannabis use in those individuals. Well, you can see that there's a strong association. Anytime the yellow and the green dots are close, that means that, whoa, you got, when you had a high rate or prevalence of cannabis use in the population, that is, let's take London here. When you had a high rate, we had roughly 15% London people reported cannabis use daily during the study period, and you had an incidence rate of, here's the prevalence of daily cannabis use, right around 12%, and you had a high rate of psychosis incidence. Oh, look, when the rate of using daily cannabis use is lower, 4%, luckily Cambridge came in with, a natural control. Look at how the rate of new cases is much lower. Well, Amsterdam, not a news bulletin, right? High rate of daily use, fairly high rate of new cases. Low, low. Madrid was a mixed bag, didn't kind of follow the model. But here we go. Barcelona followed it, low, low, high. You can see my point. When a given community had a high rate of daily cannabis use, they had higher rates of new cases of psychosis. And here's the potency data. Same kind of principle. The green now represents the percent that had used high potency cannabis. Now they measured people's cannabis use. They brought it in the lab and they called it high potency if it had THC level greater than 10%. Anyways, what do you notice about the bars? They kind of follow a similar pattern. Hey, Cambridge, not too many people using high potency, stayed nice and low with the incidence rate. Oh, London, not so good. Had a kind of a high rate of potency, not so great incidence. So this was the first study that did two things. They had multiple sites and they could track new cases as a function of daily cannabis use, and they found a strong association. And then they also looked at new cases as a function of using high potency and still found a strong association. Did you notice the R's on the two slides? This one is 0.7. That's the correlation. That's very strong in behavior psychology. You can get a correlation of 0.7. I'll go backwards. This is a daily 0.8. These are extremely strong findings. And it was multiple sites, not just one. The Danish folks did a similar study. I won't go into the details, but you may know about the Danish health system. They have a nationwide register-based historical health system for all its citizens from day one. They don't have HIPAA regulations in Denmark. So you can do all kinds of interesting health studies by just looking and tracking from their national database. Well, somebody looked at the incidence of schizophrenia and how recent cannabis use disorders are showing up in hospitals. And here's the shape, and here's the shape. What do you notice? Right around 1999, the incidence of schizophrenia starts to go up. There's a little relief, but then it goes back up. And what around 1990, did I say 1999? I meant 1990 here. And right 1990, look at the incidence of recent cannabis use escalating. Here was the quote from their conclusion. The data analyses show the proportion of cases of schizophrenia associated with cannabis use disorder has increased 3 to 4-fold during the past 2 decades, which is expected given previously described increases in the use of potency of cannabis. Youth are more vulnerable. Everything I've shown you about the links, whether it's correlational, longitudinal, whether it's potency issue or daily use, it's likely that the developing brain is more vulnerable to these effects. A quote from our director of NIDA, Nora Volkoff: when the active ingredients of cannabis, THC, is consumed, the numerous cannabinoid receptors that are important to brain development are overactivated and their normal neural development can be disrupted. So I'm just showing you the same slide again. Just a reminder, look at all the regions where we have cannabinoid receptors. Remember I told you it was a safety helmet for the volume control? Well, it's also in many ways a safety helmet for normal brain development. And if you disrupt it, that volume control is going out of whack, and that can lead to developmental issues. A very strong study showed this because finally somebody had the opportunity to compare a reasonably large set of teenagers, almost 800, where they had brain imaging data at 2 time points. Their baseline was at the young part of the teen years when no one had used cannabis yet. And then they were able to brain image 800 of the teens, virtually all of them, 5 years later, when many had initiated cannabis use. And what did they find? Cannabis use during adolescence was associated with altered neural development, particularly in the regions of the brain that are rich with cannabinoid receptors. Think back to the prior slide. And there was a dose-dependent relationship. The heavier the cannabis use, the greater the alter development. Now, this is not saying it contributed to mental illness, but people are now starting to make that connection. For example, an interesting review article that just looked at a wide range of studies. And I'm going to go to their big quote, their big home run quote, related to this issue of cannabis use during adolescence and mental health. Importantly, the causal disturbances of neural processes in adulthood by virtue of using cannabis early, cannabinoid exposure are linked to behavioral phenotypes predictive of psychiatric and addiction risk. So if you read this article, you'll see that the authors are now not realizing that, yes, the data is pretty compelling that it leads to neurodevelopment disruptions, early cannabis use, but these disruptions not only perhaps have an impact on cognition and emotion and social skills development, but also have an impact on mental health. I'm showing you this again. You remember Miller's summary of the literature, and I turned it into this box, sets of boxes. Well, she also in her article highlighted where the data suggested that if in samples where young people were using cannabis during adolescence, the risk for the disorder was even greater. And she found it for 3: schizophrenia, bipolar, and risk of suicide. Risk of suicide rings a bell, doesn't it? Because there's already been suggestions of that from those prior studies I noted. But she basically noted that there's a greater risk of having these disorders if used during adolescence as opposed if you waited until adulthood. You still have a risk in adulthood, but it's even enhanced. Hard data from Forti. I think this is my last data point on this topic. I'm kind of repeating myself. You're probably getting the message, right? Age of onset's pretty important with cannabis use. This showed how levels of cannabis use impacted the mean age and years of onset by exposure. So these little numbers, forget the numbers in parentheses, are the mean age of onset of your first episode of psychosis. So the larger the number, basically the better news for the person. It means in this group had their mean age of onset of psychosis was 31, age 31. This group, their mean age of onset was 25. So this group suffers from the disorder about 6 years more and likely has a lot of other complications. Now, just for the time being, we'll just stick with, well, they have 6 more years of the disorder on average than this group. Well, what distinguishes this group from this group? Level of cannabis use. Our light yellow over here never used cannabis. Our darkest green over here, they were daily users of what's called, in Europe, it's called skunk. That's basically high-end THC potency products. Basically, your highest end hash would be skunk. So this was interesting. 6 years difference impacting onset. It doesn't really say it caused psychosis, does it? But it surely can alter a very important trajectory point. One more, not only are people suffering 6 more years of the disorder, likely, but if you look at data on schizophrenia, on age of onset, regardless of whether you use cannabis or not, earlier onset psychosis individuals often have more episodes of psychosis throughout their life. When they have an episode, the episode is longer, and they often are less likely to benefit from medication. So that's 3 additional strikes against a person. The 4th would be you suffer longer. my sidebar is cannabis use early in life risk for something else. Yes, cannabis use disorder. Perhaps not a news bulletin. If you use enough of a substance, you're going to risk for a disorder for that substance. But recent data now shows that if you are use or begin use in adolescence, the risk is much greater. Look at these two numbers, 10 and 20, versus if you waited till young adulthood, basically early college years, much lower numbers. Why the two different bars? They measured whether you had a cannabis use disorder within 12 months or within 36 months. But the bottom line is much worse scenario if you initiate a cannabis use during adolescence. You may know about the National ABCD study, Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. It has been underway now for about 6 years, and they're studying over 13,000 children, and they enrolled them before age of typical use of any substance, including tobacco, and then they're going to try to follow the sample for many, many years, hopefully for decades. But we'll learn more about many of the questions that are trying to be answered when it comes to what happens with the teenager developing brain and their lives when they use substances early in life. So before I get into the all-important, how does this information help you in your work? Just a little bit about why THC might impact mental illness. Hopefully you saw that the data is getting pretty strong, that it has a contributing role. But why does it do it? Well, this slide looking familiar, doesn't it? Just remind you that if you think about your ability to, let's see, experience sensations, have judgment, experience rewards, and have memory. I'll just take those 4 functions. If those are disrupted, that surely could lead you to not feel good about yourself or about life around you, and surely could affect your mood and increase risk for mental illness. But they have studied this in more detail. And remember I said the cannabinoid system, or sometimes called the endocannabinoid system, is like a safety helmet. Well, it not only is just a general safety helmet, but it's really important as a safety helmet for the dopamine system. You may know dopamine is an important neurotransmitter that affects affect and thinking, and it's implicated significantly in risk for psychosis. So basically, disrupted or deficit in your dopamine system increases your elevation for psychosis. And by using marijuana, you are disrupting the wonderful safety helmet for your dopamine system, that being the endocannabinoid safety helmet. So just a little more detail about THC contributing to neurodevelopment problems and brain functioning, but it perhaps quite specifically impacts disrupting your important dopamine system. You want a healthy dopamine system, or sometimes called the dopamine synthesis system, and you don't want to hurt the safety helmet for it, because you want to optimize your mental health. They've studied this with rats. It's hard to get this kind of detail with humans, although with improved neuroimaging that we're going to see more of that. But the bottom line is, one of the things they found when they studied this with rats is that it disrupted the developmental pruning. And this might be why that developing brain is particularly at risk. So you don't want to disrupt your pruning, because then that impacts sort of the neural connections in your brain. And what they found is that early exposure to the adolescent rat accelerated developmental pruning. Well, that actually is a bad news, because by accelerating it, it removed neural connections that it shouldn't have. And the absence of these neural connections continued in the animal's adult neural circuitry. So it wasn't corrected, or there wasn't an adaptation biologically. And unfortunately, then the animal grew up with this deficit or absence of some neural connections. So that bodes poorly for brain health and early exposure to cannabis. Kind of a noisy slide. This is a reminder that for some of us, our risk for schizophrenia is based in genetics. And so there's a dopamine related gene that has been looked at and implicated. Schizophrenia is not a single gene disorder, but one of the genes is pretty powerful. And it looks like it interacts with cannabis use to significantly elevate risk for schizophrenia. So that's why you see this very large green bar here. That says that if you use cannabis every day and you had a version of this dopamine gene, you may know that there's variants of a given gene where you have with the 4 enzymes, you can have a variability in it. But if you have a certain variant of it where it's 2 alleles that look like this, and you'd use cannabis every day, your risk of schizophrenia is 7 times greater than you could have a variant of the dopamine gene, but not the nasty allele combination. And even if you use cannabis daily, you wouldn't have much of an elevated risk. So that's why when people look at studies and you're getting, people that are using cannabis every day, even if they got a family history of schizophrenia, they aren't necessarily going to show signs of schizophrenia because they might have got lucky and didn't get inherited what might be called the safer variant or the safer alleles of the dopamine gene. Some people are worried that because our country's going more pro-marijuana, we are going to increase the access, increase the use. And what might that increase? The Europeans are saying incidence. That's why the European study is so important. Daily use showed higher incidence. High potency THC showed high incidence. And so as America gets more green, unfortunately, there's going to be more access, probably more daily users, and most states do not limit THC. And so you're going to have a lot of easy access to the high potency stuff. It's concerning on the mental health end of things. One of the recent articles commented on this. I'll read you his middle paragraph. In theory, it is possible to legalize cannabis in ways that do not increase potency and prevalence of use, but so far, experience with commercialization in North America is not encouraging. Governments that decide to legalize cannabis should use some of the tax revenue to monitor cannabis price, consumption, and potency levels, and to carefully evaluate the long-term repercussions for mental health. Such monitoring would enable policies to be developed to minimize harm. A pretty good point. Can't disagree at all with any of that. Okay, some prevention and treatment issues, and then we'll see if there's time if you have some questions. If you're inclined to move policymakers towards a safer direction, here's just 3 big themes that I've learned when I've talked to experts in the field. One is to make sure you educate policymakers that the promises of the pro-cannabis industry are rarely realized. There are many now reports from states that have legalized that pretty much suggest voter remorse. And the health impacts are significant. They are not minor. Do not let the pro-marijuana people say people can't overdose from cannabis. They're correct on that. That is just one out of several important health impacts that have to be examined and looked at. And just to lean on that one is quite absurd. Many states, when they can fend off efforts to commercialize by just getting more sane with decriminalization. And I think a lot of states should look at what is their penalties for possession of small amounts. I know our state, Minnesota, is looking at that. Perhaps there'll be movement on that next year. The notion is turn it into a civil fine and not have it on your record. If a region, the state has to go commercialization, there are some smart policies allowing local communities to opt out, et cetera, all the way to rigorous compliance checks. For youth, it's quite important to educate them about the perception of harm. Unfortunately, we're losing the battle. So my green arrow shows you trend data in America among 10th grade students, just one of the data points that's available, of past month cannabis use, basically from 2006 to 2020. It's an upward trend with a little vacation of that upward trend right here. But what's not helping? There's a decrease in perception of harm in that same time period. So you get, as you may know, unfortunately with young people, when perception of harm is decreased, the use goes up. So programs need to address that directly. At the treatment level, I have three to bring to bear. One is addressing myths about cannabis with your clients. I've just listed 4 here that sometimes come up, and these are all merit attention. And all of them, I think, can be answered on the mental health side. It cannot alleviate symptoms of emotional distress in an effective way. It's not medicine for psychosis or depression or anxiety. Yes, it can be addictive, and yes, you can be a poor driver. If you want more information about ways to address what might be myths or misperceptions about cannabis, I've got 2 websites here. One's the federal government, and one is the interesting website, Learn About SAM. Use evidence-based treatment when addressing cannabis use disorder. The 12-step program, cognitive behavior therapy, those have been shown also to be effective. It might mean you have to highlight it a little bit more if you have a person that's using cannabis more than alcohol. And with young adults, if they're able to and willing to get treatment, particularly cognitive behavior therapy approaches are effective. If people are interested in a little more details on number 2, just send me an email. And perhaps not a news bulletin, advising clients, particularly who are suffering from psychosis, educate them on the importance of not starting to use, and if they are currently using, to halt their use. One summary study about how effective is cannabis for the range of mental disorders. So I'm going to read you the first and third bullet. There is scarce evidence to suggest that cannabinoids, basically THC, improve depressive disorders and symptoms, anxiety disorders, ADHD, Tourette syndrome, post-traumatic stress, or psychosis. The second bullet's interesting. There's low quality evidence that maybe the pharmaceutical grade THC can have small improvement in symptoms of anxiety, but among people who have other medical conditions, not people who suffer from anxiety disorders. So I want to caution people not to think yet that THC is effective treatment. Now, CBD is getting some attention, and I thought this was an interesting quote from one of her talks, an expert in UK on addiction. You've seen some of her slides. The Forti study was, the one that the multi-site one. Her quote: "Some promising early indications about CBD may be being effective medicine to treat addiction to cannabis. We are starting a controlled trial. Stay tuned." She's looking at the topic, maybe CBD, forget about it being helpful for elbow pain. It might be helpful for those that are addicted to THC. So that'll be something to look forward to. In summary, I hopefully you appreciated that I wanted to emphasize that THC is a very significant and potent drug that impacts the brain significantly and other parts of the body. That impact on the brain is particularly vulnerable for the developing brain, but whether it's the developing brain or the non-developing brain, it looks like, particularly if one is using heavily in the high potency products, it can affect your risk of onsetting for mental illness and impact, unfortunately, the course of the mental illness in a negative way. And claims that it's medicine and that it is not harmful to mental health, I think, are a great disservice to us in the public health field. Okay, thank you for your time. I don't know if people want to hang around for any Q&A, but I appreciate the opportunity today.
Yes, we will give out copies of the slides that'll be sent in your follow-up email. So if anybody has a question, please unmute yourself and Ken can stay on for a couple minutes to address those.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Hi.
Hi, thanks. Corrine Case calling from Massachusetts. Thank you so much for this information. I'm wondering if there are any studies about cessation of marijuana use and changes in psychosis
Excellent.
improvement.
Yes. Yes. And you've reminded me of even a layer to your question. Yes, there now not enough long-term study to know, is this mean somebody is going to have less courses? Are they going to respond to treatment better? Because I haven't seen that. I always worry that is, a negative of cannabis use for someone with psychosis. But yes, abating or a reduction, a minimizing of symptoms has been shown in the literature. And now that's with psychosis. I haven't seen, you got to think, if you're suicidal and you're having suicidal ideation, if you stop using, you're probably using cannabis. Hopefully you're getting less of these nasty suicidal thoughts. Now that isn't in the literature. I'm just applying some clinical, common sense. But I got to believe that also is, it would be a positive benefit. I also remind clinicians and clients, you don't want to get in the habit of thinking, well, I'm taking medicine. It's THC or CBD. I like it. So I'm not going to take my other stuff that's prescribed. And that isn't necessarily a good route to go, as many of us know. And you can get, I remind clients, you're going to maybe feel really good with 3 weeks of CBD and no side effects. And then I say, well, let's see how things are going at 5 weeks and 6 weeks, because placebo effect can have a big impact on all of us, regardless of your mental health, mental illness, regardless of your symptoms. And that's why you always have to try to see if your placebo effect is washed out. And sometimes it takes 2 to 3 or 4 weeks. I tell the anecdote of my problem gambling researcher. Problem gamblers are some of the more impulsive, addictive individuals if you've ever treated them. They've got big behavioral issues with impulsivity. When they do these medication trials for problem gamblers, they have what's called a placebo washout period, where they don't tell anyone this. They just start people on the trial. And if somebody is still saying that they feel like they got improved symptoms after 3 weeks, they're just given a sugar pill. They aren't in the study, the real study that would start next, because they know that they're just a placebo responder. And then that is going to deter from their ability to find out there's real effects with the medication. So people have this phenomenon. It's part of our, human biology, most likely. Anyways, long way of saying, remind your clients that yes, you might be getting wonderful temporary relief, but that isn't necessarily the long-term route you should go.
Thank you, Ken. There's another question. Is there any regulation for testing, measuring amount of THC in CBD products? Some of these clients have high mental health issues.
Yes, some states are doing a very good job with the package labeling and consumer information, and some states, my understanding, are doing a lousy job. So it is incumbent, if you have a client that's using, that they get smart with, are you buying it? I mean, it's one advantage of a controlled, commercialized market that's also regulated nicely by the state, where a person can look at the package labeling and say, no, I got to stick, with the low level stuff, and the package label is accurate. That's helpful if somebody's going to be using. Obviously, the stuff on the street, you don't know. CBD packaging information, I think, is more of a slippery slope, because a lot of states aren't regulating it when it's just sold at the nutrition stores. So I'm not sure I would necessarily trust what's on the label. Now, I'll just take one state. They have both. You can get your medical marijuana. You can ask for THC only, CBD only, or a mix. And so then you can order it that way. And that's kind of a nice deal. and it's not sold in commercial stores, so you're getting it through licensed pharmacists. There's a lot of other problems with that program, including cost, but that state was kind of smart about it because they wanted to at least offer options, and they had a way to control it because it's all regulated by the state, and the producers are not incentivized to get their product viewed as inaccurate.
You can.
By the way, I don't know if there's any real science about it, and I never got a chance to ask to Forti this, but when they labeled high potency 10% or higher, I wondered where they came up with that, that line in the sand. But it strikes me that if you were going down the worst case scenario, you got a client, he or she is going to keep using, they can't be convinced not to use. Can you convince them to, enjoy, I'll call it enjoy a product that's below 10% THC? I'm being arbitrary and I don't really have any real science behind it, but it just strikes me the lower percent, the better. And maybe below 10% is a reasonable number.
She was saying in Oregon, this is one of the states not monitoring these levels, so the patients are under the actual impression that they're buying products without THC.
Right.
Could be a huge issue.
Yeah, exactly. You got to, I mean, it's even the commercialized states, they didn't set up the infrastructure to monitor. It's one of the problems. In many states, they didn't regulate how many dispensaries. Maybe the only restriction would be a county could opt out. But the problem was you get a lot of dispensaries. The market looked like it was there. It's relatively inexpensive to establish a dispensary. I don't think there were a lot of hurdles to get licensed. But then that meant, well, how are we going to monitor this? And dispensaries have multiple products. So, imagine a liquor store. There's basically three types of products: beer, wine, and liquor. And I know, and there's ranges of the alcohol content level for those three. So that isn't as onerous as, oh my gosh, you got vaping products, you got non-vaping products, you got edibles, and different kinds of edibles, different kinds of smoke product, whoa. Cumbersome.
Oh, yes.
And open for misinformation or people not having the right education.
Right. Well, I think we should wrap up for today. I appreciate you all staying on afterwards and asking Dr. Winters these questions. It was nice to see everybody be able to stay on after for the Q&A. So Ken, this was great. This is very informative, and we will send out all the handouts and follow-up email to those of you who have registered. So be looking for that, and we appreciate your attendance. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Megan and Natasha and everyone. Have a rest of a good week.
You too, Ken. Thank you.
Thank you.